All right, so I'm going to talk for just a minute about James Nibley, and he was born in Scotland in June of 1810, and actually, most of my information I'm going to share with you is about his journey to the United States. I don't have a lot of information on his childhood in Scotland. His wife was also born in Scotland. Her name was Jean Wilson Nibley. And they were married and had 5 children in Scotland and when they joined the church. And in his obituary it says that he was, here, let me read it. It says that that they were some of the very first to receive the gospel in that country. And so they were with this, a lot of these same Scotch people that were introduced to the gospel and joined the church and started making plans to immigrate to Zion, which is how things, that now people get when they join the church, they stay where they live, but that this was a millennialist church in the very beginning, which meant everybody gathered. And so that's why you see all this immigration. And so I'm going to give a plug for the speaker tomorrow night, because that is what his specialty is on the immigration. He's a BYU professor and he's an amazing presenter, and we have live bagpipes coming. So come and bring your friends and neighbors. Now back to James. So they had 5 children when they came here to the United States in 1855. And they lived in Rhode Island. And they were there gathering provisions for several years. And in fact, James said he called his ever thrifty and prudent mother Jane, and his stalwart father James had... So most of this information actually comes out of Charles Nibley's history. Charles is their son, and that's who Nibley is named after. So it's the same family. And he grew up here as a boy in Wellsville. Charles Nibley did. So really, Charles Nibley is from Wellsville, so that's kind of funny, huh? Anyway, they had earned $2,000 to $3,000, and it got to be 1860, which is when the country is on the cusp of the Civil War. And they're living in New England. And so, and they have older children. At that point, they would have had, their oldest daughter, Mary, was 17. James was 14. And then they also had a few younger boys. And so they thought, it's time to stop preparing, it's time to go to Utah. Because they didn't want to get sucked into this Civil War. So this was their journey, and I'm going to read this because I think it's amazing what they did. So they auctioned off all the belongings that they had left. In May of 1860, so they were in Rhode Island. They went to Boston, where they joined a company of other saints. From Boston, they went to Albany, New York. Then from there, they rode to the Mohawk Valley, which on what was called the New York Central Railroad. From there, they went to Buffalo through Niagara Falls. Then they got on the Michigan Central Railroad, went through Canada to Detroit, and then to Chicago. Then from Chicago, they got on a different train and went to Hannibal. From there, they went to St. Joseph on the Missouri River. And so that was the farthest that any railroad extended to the west. So again, 1860, 9 years before the Transcontinental Railroad, right, which was our big celebration this year here in Utah. And so once they got as far west as the trains could take them in Nebraska, they got on a boat and went up to Florence, which is about 6 miles north of Omaha. And so that's where they gathered. They were there actually for quite a while. It says that, so we have James and his wife, and they have, at this point they have 6 children. Mary is 22, James is 19, Margaret is 17, Charles is 11, Henry is 8, and Euphemia. It's spelt with an N, it's spelt with an M, and it's spelt with an R in different things. So something like that. She was 5. And they were, again, as Heather said, they were a bit older when they are now in Nebraska getting ready to trek across the plains. in July or June of 1860. James is 50 and his wife is 45 when they're getting ready, and they have a 5-year-old they're chasing too at the same time. So I'm just going to read out of Charles' history for just a minute because I love his this is him talking. He says, so now they're in Florence and getting ready to actually set out across the plains. Here we met a large number of immigrating saints congregating there and outfitting for their travel across the plains. Meetings were held regularly, hymns sung everywhere and oft, and the religious enthusiasm and spirit of the people were entirely different from what we had left behind in the East. So again, there was a lot of fear of the war, and the Civil War was brewing. And so it was from a child's perspective, he was very excited because he felt the enthusiasm and the how people were just hopeful and had this great adventure they were looking for in this better life in Zion. They were with a company. The captain was J.D. Ross, and he talked about George Buchanan, who was there, and he was in charge of the immigration in Florence. He would buy cattle, wagons, and supplies, and then help get them to the saints, either those that could afford to buy them, as the Nibleys proudly were able to buy their own. There was also the Perpetual Immigrating Fund, and so that helped others who didn't have the provisions the Nibleys did. He also noted that while they were there preparing, because they were waiting till the first part of June to leave, he saw the apostles Amasa Lyman, Charles Rich, who was, he says, not an apostle yet, a younger man, and Joseph F. Smith, who were all on their way to fill missions in Europe. So they kind of crossed paths as they were going. So I think that's kind of neat too. He said their specific outfit consisted of a brand new wagon, 2 yoke of oxen, and 2 cows. They had a new charter oak stove in the wagon and their tent, bedding, provisions, and etc. He said they were there in Florence for about a month, and they lived in an old shack of a house that was just good enough to keep some of the rain out. So they left Nebraska June 17th and arrived in Salt Lake on September 3rd. So that's less than 3 months, so that's actually really good. That shows that they didn't have any major holdups or trials. Their company had 250 people, 36 wagons, 142 oxen, and 54 cows. They traveled about 90 miles a week, about 15 miles a day for 6 days a week, and they never traveled on the Sabbath. He says, I remember how green we all were with respect to yoking up cattle or milking cows or greasing the wagon or in doing anything that pertained to frontier or pioneer life. He said that in Florence, when they first received their 2 yoke of cattle from Cannon, that his father got on the offside of the cattle and tried to drive them, and of course they were frightened and just ran away down the hill. So I don't know if we think about that, so we just think of it as the pioneers in the olden days. So of course they all knew how to do things like drive oxen and do horse things that we don't do because we drive cars, right? But even for them, a lot of them, they were miners and they were other things, and so for them to drive a team of oxen was a whole new skill set they had to learn. I thought that was interesting. I never really thought about that before. And he did say that there were a few inconveniences along the way. He especially enjoyed the tens of thousands of buffalo they would see along the trail, and that sometimes they would have to be held up for over an hour just letting them pass because the herds were so immense. But he really liked it when they were able to eat some of their meat. And he also talked about how there were terrific lightning and rainstorms in Nebraska. And they did have not too many hardships during their journey until they got to the crossing of the Green River. They had one of their best ox, it just says he laid down and died. So then they only had 3 ox and 2 cows, so they yoked up one of the cows, and that it actually did pretty well because by then they'd consumed enough of their provisions that their load was light enough that the cow was fine. So, and then they remember that George A. Smith and other apostles came up to the mountain to meet them when they finally made it into the Salt Lake Valley on September 3rd. So about 3 months on their journey. From there, the Nibley family moved here to Wellsville, and this is where they lived their whole lives. As far as the parents, the children didn't all stay here. And so, to wrap up really quick, I just want to read you the last line of his obituary, because I think if somebody wrote this, I think this is about the best anybody could write about somebody, to give you an insight of what James Nibley was like. And he was an older gentleman, and so I like the way they worded this. He said he has led the most exemplary life, and his death, though not altogether unexpected, is deeply regretted by the whole community. I think that's a really lovely way of putting that, because I'm sure we've all experienced deaths of loved ones that have gotten to an age where we feel that way about them. But this is the best part. He says, "The people of Wellsville had learned to value him for his true worth, for he was justly regarded by all as a faithful and humble saint, an industrious and useful member of society, a patient and forgiving brother, an indulgent husband and father, and an honest man." That's everything.